Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. This time, we're going deep into the world of endocrine disruptors,
Endocrine disruptors.
EDCs. You sent over a really interesting mix of research on EDCs, medical journals, scientific reviews, even some pieces from consumer health websites.
Yeah, it's a hot topic.
It seems like these chemicals are everywhere, and they have a big impact on us by messing with our hormones.
That's right, our hormones.
So we're going to unpack all of that today.
All of that.
Exploring potential problems like reproductive issues, obesity, ADHD, and even links to cancer.
Potentially, yeah.
So maybe we should start with you giving us a really clear definition of what an endocrine disruptor is.
Yeah, so endocrine disruptors, or EDCs, they can be either natural or synthetic.
Okay.
That's interesting, right?
Yeah, it is. I didn't realize that they could be natural.
Yeah, some are and some are man-made. But both natural or synthetic, the sheer number of potential EDCs is astounding.
Wow.
We could be talking about thousands of different chemicals.
Dear thousands.
Yeah, potentially thousands.
Oh, wow, that's a lot.
It makes this a really complex issue to study. To understand the impact, we need to think about how our hormones work in the first place.
Okay, so how do they work?
Well, you can think of hormones like messengers. Tiny messengers traveling throughout your body. They control everything from growth and development to metabolism and mood.
Okay.
So even the slightest interference from an EDC can have a ripple effect throughout the body.
That makes a lot of sense. So we have all these EDCs potentially causing all kinds of problems, but where are we encountering these things?
Well, that's the scary part. They're incredibly pervasive.
Oh, no.
They really are. They're lurking in everyday products like BPA in plastic bottles and food cans, or phthalates in medical devices, toys, even cosmetics.
Oh, wow.
Then there are pesticides, flame retardants.
It's starting to sound like they're practically everywhere.
They are practically everywhere. And here's something a lot of people don't realize. Even some natural substances can act as endocrine disruptors too, like phytoestrogens, which are found in soy.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so phytoestrogens are plant compounds, but they can mimic the effects of estrogen in the body.
Wow, so it's not just a matter of avoiding certain products if there are natural things as well. It really does seem like they're just a part of modern life.
Yeah, unfortunately they are.
This makes me want to understand the health risks even better. What are the biggest concerns?
Yeah, so the range of potential health problems linked to EDCs is very broad, but one of the biggest areas of concern is reproductive health.
Okay.
EDCs can interfere with fertility in both men and women.
Oh, wow.
There's one tragic example of this with a drug called diethylstilbestrol.
DE.
Yeah, DES. It's a synthetic estrogen.
Yeah.
It was actually prescribed to pregnant women to prevent miscarriages, but it ended up having devastating long-term effects.
Wait, yeah, I remember reading about DES in one of the articles you sent over. What were those effects?
Well, daughters who were exposed to DES in the womb had an increased risk of developing a rare form of vaginal cancer called clear cell carcinoma.
Oh.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop there. The effects of DES stretched across generations.
What do you mean?
Grandchildren of women who took DES may have an increased risk of ADHD.
Wow.
Yeah, it really highlights the potential for EDCs to have these long-lasting, multi-generational impacts.
Yeah, you're right. That detail about the grandchildren is really what stuck with me, too, from that article. Makes the whole issue seem much more urgent, right?
Yeah.
What about other health problems? What else are these EDCs linked to?
Beyond reproductive health, they're also linked to metabolic disorders. Certain phthalates, for example, may contribute to both obesity and metabolic syndrome.
I see.
And, in the U.S. alone, the economic impact of these conditions is huge, almost $40 billion annually.
Wow, that's a staggering number.
It is.
If the impact is so huge, why aren't there more regulations in place to limit our exposure to these chemicals?
That's the big question, and it leads us to one of the biggest challenges with addressing the issue of EDCs. It can be really difficult to prove a direct cause and effect relationship between exposure to a specific EDC and a health outcome.
I can imagine that research is complex. What makes it so difficult?
Well, one major hurdle is that there's often what's called a latency period.
A latency period.
Yeah, so the effects of exposure might not show up for years, even decades. So you're essentially trying to connect something that happened a long time ago to a health issue in the present.
Oh, I see. But even with that long delay, wouldn't long-term studies pick up on those connections?
They try, but it's not so straightforward. Another difficulty is that we're rarely exposed to just one EDC at a time.
Right.
It's usually a mixture of multiple chemicals. This makes it really tough to isolate the impact of each individual EDC.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
And of course, there are also ethical limitations on conducting certain types of studies on humans.
So it sounds like it's a bit of a scientific puzzle to untangle all those potential factors.
It really is.
But even with that, research in the field has been advancing.
It has, yeah. Scientists are actually developing new tools and methods to help us better understand the mechanisms of action of EDCs and to help assess the potential risks.
That's good to hear.
It is.
So while research continues, what can people do to minimize their exposure right now?
You know, it's pretty much impossible to completely eliminate exposure. But there are things that you can do to reduce your risk. Choosing fresh foods over processed options whenever possible can really help.
Makes sense.
And opt for glass or stainless steel containers instead of plastic.
Okay, that's good advice. What about when you can't avoid plastic? Like so many food products come packaged in plastic. Is there anything we should be looking out for on labels?
Yeah, you're right. It is really hard to avoid plastic completely these days. Reading labels is a really good tip.
Okay.
And then just doing a little bit of research into ingredients before you buy something can really help you make better choices.
I see.
So, for example, you can look for products that are labeled as BPA-free.
Oh, okay. That's a good reminder. Be a more informed consumer.
Exactly.
It makes me think about everyday choices and things that seem harmless. Like, for example, stevia.
Stevia.
That popular sugar substitute. It's often marketed as a healthy alternative, but I've read that there might be some endocrine-disrupting effects.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, stevia is generally considered safe when it's consumed in moderation, but some studies have suggested that steviol glycosides, those are the sweet compounds in stevia, they could potentially interfere with hormone production.
Really?
Yeah. There was one study, for example, that found that human sperm cells exposed to steviol showed an increase in progesterone production.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so even when we're trying to make healthier choices, like opting for a sugar substitute, we still need to be aware of the potential risks.
Right, yeah. So even with good intentions, things can backfire.
Yeah, you really do have to stay informed. Being aware of ongoing research is
Mm.
crucial. More research is definitely needed to understand the long-term effects of stevia on humans, especially regarding the potential endocrine disruption effects.
Yeah, that makes sense. This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered so much ground already.
Yeah, we have.
Defining EDCs, understanding their impact on our health, and how hard it is to study them.
Yeah.
But we're not done yet. We'll be right back after a short break.
Welcome back to our deep dive on EDCs. Before we move on, I wanted to circle back to something we touched on earlier about the challenges of doing research on these chemicals.
Yeah, you're right. We were talking about how hard it is to prove those cause and effect relationships.
Exactly. It's really hard to tie a specific EDC to a specific health problem.
It's almost like trying to solve a mystery with missing pieces, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that complexity makes it even more important to think about the wider context.
What do you mean?
We need to consider the social and economic factors at play as well, not just the science.
Oh, you're talking about health disparities.
Exactly, yeah. When we talk about EDCs, it's not just the chemicals themselves, it's also about who is most vulnerable to them.
So certain communities might be at greater risk than others.
Yeah. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that low-income and minority populations often face much higher levels of EDC exposure.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and this unequal burden contributes to those existing health disparities. It makes things even worse.
I see. So if you're already facing a lot of systemic disadvantages, exposure to these harmful chemicals is only going to compound those challenges.
Exactly. So addressing these health disparities that are related to EDCs, it really requires a multifaceted approach. We need stronger regulations, of course, to protect these vulnerable communities. But we also need increased access to things like healthcare and education.
Right, to help people understand the risks.
Exactly, so they can understand the risks and make informed choices.
It sounds like we need to think about this issue from a social justice perspective, right, as much as a scientific one.
Absolutely. Environmental health is really intricately linked with social justice. We can't address one without thinking about the other.
Okay, so we've talked about the effects of EDCs, the problems with studying them, and this issue of health disparities. It feels like a lot to take in.
It is a lot.
But it's also kind of empowering to understand it,
Absolutely.
to see that bigger picture.
Knowledge is power. That's
Yeah.
what they say, right?
Yeah.
And by understanding the risks, we can start to actually advocate for change.
So speaking of change, What are some of the things being done to regulate these EDCs and to understand them better?
There's a lot happening right now in the research world, which is really encouraging. Scientists are working on a bunch of new tools and models to help identify potential EDCs much more quickly. And they're getting better at understanding how these chemicals actually work inside the body.
Oh, that's great. Can you give us some specific examples of the new things being done?
Sure. So the National Toxicology Program, or NTP, is
Hmm.
really at the forefront of this research. Yeah, and they're doing all these extensive studies to evaluate the effects of a wide range of EDCs. This is providing really valuable data that's being used for risk assessment
Huh.
and also to inform regulation.
So they're kind of like detectives in a way, right?
Yeah,
Gathering evidence.
exactly. They're gathering evidence to help us really understand the risks of all these chemicals. And, they're not working alone. There are also other amazing initiatives, such as the Tox 21 program.
Oh, yeah, I've read about that one. That's the one that uses robots, right?
Yeah, exactly. So Tox 21 uses robotics and high-throughput screening techniques to assess really quickly the potential endocrine-disrupting activity of literally thousands of chemicals.
Wow.
So really a game changer in terms of efficiency.
It's amazing how technology is being used in this space
Yeah.
to solve such a complex issue.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. And, the advancements go even further than that. Researchers are also developing new biomarkers, which are essentially measurable indicators.
Yeah.
These are used to assess exposure to EDCs and their potential effects on our bodies.
So we're not just relying on those traditional methods anymore, right? We're using these really cutting-edge approaches and technologies to get a clearer picture of this really complex problem.
Exactly. And all this research is super crucial because it helps us understand the link between exposure to EDCs and health outcomes, which then helps inform policy decisions and regulatory actions.
Okay, so it's not just about doing the research, it's also about making sure that those findings actually lead to real-world changes.
Exactly, yeah. The goal is to use this knowledge to protect public health and try to prevent any future harm.
It's a very powerful message of hope, right? That even though the challenges are really big and significant, there are people working hard to make a difference.
Absolutely. And it's not just scientists and researchers working on this. It's also policymakers, advocates, and informed citizens like yourself who are pushing for change.
You're right. We all have a part to play, whether it's making smart choices as consumers, supporting groups that are working on this issue, or calling for stricter regulations.
Well said. Collective action is really essential here.
Okay, so we've explored the science, the research, and the need for these big systemic solutions. As we wrap up this section of our deep dive, I wanted to bring it back to a personal level.
Okay.
What does all this mean for us as individuals?
I think the biggest takeaway is that knowledge is power. By understanding the risks of EDCs, we can make more informed choices to protect ourselves and our families.
Yeah, you're right. We're not powerless.
No.
We can take action to reduce our exposure, and we can speak up to advocate for change.
Exactly. Every action, no matter how small it is, can contribute to this larger movement.
Right.
And that movement is actually gaining a lot of momentum right now. People are becoming much more aware of EDCs, and they're demanding action.
That's encouraging to hear.
It is. It gives me a lot of hope for the future.
Me too.
Hope is really essential because while the challenges are very real, so are the solutions. And if we work together, we can create a much healthier and safer world for everyone, for ourselves and for future generations to come.
I agree. This deep dive has been so insightful. I've honestly learned so much about a topic I didn't know much about before.
I'm really glad to hear that. It's been my pleasure to share all this information with you.
All right, everybody, get ready for the final part of our deep dive. We'll be bringing it all together and exploring some of the thought-provoking questions that we hope will leave you thinking long after this episode ends.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive on endocrine disruptors. We've covered so much, from the science behind EDCs to the problems with research and the reality of those health disparities.
Yeah, we really have. It's been quite a journey, exploring this whole complex issue.
It really has. Before we wrap up, I'd love to know what stood out to you most from our conversation. Was there anything that really surprised you or that you thought was particularly significant?
I think what always gets me is just how widespread these chemicals are. As we talked about, they're basically everywhere. Like unavoidable in the modern world.
Yeah.
In our food, our water, the products we use, even the air we breathe.
That's a lot. It is. And it
It
makes
is.
me think that we really need some big solutions here, right?
Systemic solutions.
Exactly. We can't just rely on individuals to avoid this stuff.
Yeah, it really does feel like a shared responsibility. for individuals to make those choices, but also for policymakers and industries to help create safer environments, right?
Right, and it's not just about protecting ourselves now. It's
Yeah.
about, protecting future generations as well.
That brings you to another point that stuck with me, that whole issue of health disparities. It's not a level playing field when we're talking about exposure to EDCs.
No, unfortunately not.
Uh-huh.
Certain communities are definitely bearing a much heavier burden because of all those social, economic, and environmental factors,
Yeah.
like we talked about.
It's a good reminder that, we can't talk about EDCs without acknowledging those bigger systems that make some people more vulnerable.
Yeah.
Okay, so we know they're a big problem. We've talked about how complex they are. But this is where I get stuck. With so much that we don't know, how do we balance, the good things about modern life with all these potential risks to our health?
That is the big question.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer, right? I think it's a balancing act. We have to weigh the benefits of some products and technologies against the long-term consequences for our health and the environment.
Right.
It's tricky.
It sounds like we need to be much more cautious, right? Like instead of waiting for proof that something's harmful, maybe we need to be better at identifying and reducing those potential risks before they become a problem.
I think that's a really smart approach.
Hmm.
We need to shift away from reacting to problems and be more preventative.
Yeah. Yeah.
That means investing more in research to find safer chemicals and pushing for stricter rules and regulations.
Right, to protect everyone. Well, this whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me, I think for our listeners as well. It's clear that EDCs are a serious problem, but it's also clear that we can do something about it.
I completely agree. Knowledge is power.
Right.
And
Yeah.
understanding the risks can really help us make smarter decisions, both in our own lives and as people who want to make a difference.
So what's the most important message you'd want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I would say it's about taking action.
Yeah.
Stay curious, stay engaged, and use your voice to demand safer products and a healthier environment.
Well said. This has been a really incredible journey into the world of endocrine disruptors. We explored the science, the challenges, and some of the potential solutions.
And hopefully we inspired our listeners to learn more and to get involved.
I have no doubt about that. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive. Thank you for joining us on this exploration.
It's been my pleasure. And until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.